The night Joanna Whitmore discovered her family was selling her off like damaged livestock, she made a decision that would destroy them all. Standing outside the parlor door with trembling hands full of her sister's laundry, she heard every word. Her father's booming laugh, her mother's relieved DI, Vivian's cruel joke about the plain one finally becoming someone else's problem. They'd accepted rancher Gideon Hale's proposal, not for elegant Vivian or charming Elise, but for Joanna, the daughter they'd turned into an unpaid servant, the burden they'd prayed to be rid of. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The Whitmore mansion sat like a wedding cake on the hill overlooking Millbrook. All that white paint and those columns pretending at sophistication the family had never actually possessed. Money bought a lot of things, Joanna had learned over her 23 years, but it couldn't buy decency. Couldn't buy love either, though her parents had tried purchasing both with strategic marriages for her older sisters. She'd been scrubbing the kitchen floor when Mary, the only housemaid who still spoke to her kindly, burst through the servant's entrance. "Miss Joanna, you'd better come quick. There's a letter arrived, and your father's called everyone to the parlor. Even you." Even you. Those two words carried the weight of Joanna's entire existence in this house. She pushed a strand of dark hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, careful not to touch her face with soap-raw hands. "Did he say what it's about?" Mary's eyes darted away. "No, miss, but he looks, well, excited isn't quite the word. Agitated, maybe?" Joanna stood, her knees protesting from an hour on cold tile. Her dress, a faded brown thing that had belonged to Vivian 3 years ago, was wet at the hem and smelled of lye. She looked down at herself and felt the familiar burn of shame, quickly followed by the anger she'd learned to swallow. "I suppose I should change." "No time, miss," he said immediately. Of course he did. Charles Whitmore didn't consider his youngest daughter important enough to wait for. She followed Mary through the servants' corridors, that maze of narrow passages that allowed the help to move through the house like ghosts. Joanna knew them better than the main halls now. She'd become a ghost herself in this place. The parlor doors stood open. Inside, her entire family had gathered in a tableau that would have been laughable if it hadn't made Joanna's stomach clench. Her father stood by the fireplace, one hand on the mantel in what he probably thought was a commanding pose. Her mother perched on the settee, back straight, face arranged in that expression of distant pleasantness she wore like armor. Vivian occupied the best chair near the window, where the afternoon light caught the gold in her carefully arranged curls. She was 26 now and still unwed despite 3 failed engagements, a fact that made her increasingly vicious. Elise sat beside their mother, 24, and recently returned from a rest cure after some scandal Joanna had never been told the details of. Both sisters wore afternoon dresses that cost more than most families in Millbrook earned in a year. Then there was Joanna, standing in the doorway in her wet, borrowed dress, hands red and rough, smelling of kitchen soap. "Oh, good, the help has arrived," Vivian said, examining her nails. "Are we quite finished with our summons now, Father?" Charles Whitmore's face flushed. "That's your sister you're speaking of." "Is she?" Vivian's smile could have cut glass. "Hard to tell sometimes." "Girls, please." Their mother's voice carried no real reproach. She'd stopped defending Joanna years ago, right around the time Charles had decided his youngest daughter's practical nature and sharp tongue made her unsuitable for the marriage market. Better to keep her home, he'd said. Someone had to manage the household staff. Someone had to handle the tedious details he and his wife couldn't be bothered with. That someone had become Joanna. "Close the door, Joanna," her father said. "This concerns you directly." Her heart kicked against her ribs. Nothing good ever started with those words. She pushed the door shut and stood with her back against it, maintaining her distance from the family circle. Safety in separation. Charles pulled a letter from his jacket pocket. The paper was heavy, expensive. Even from across the room, Joanna could see the bold handwriting. "I've received a most interesting proposal," he began, drawing out the moment. He'd always loved an audience. "From Gideon Hale." The name meant nothing to Joanna, but Elise gasped. "The rancher?" Elise leaned forward. "The one who owns half the valley up north? The one with the—" She caught their mother's warning look and stopped. "The very same," Charles confirmed. "He's written to ask for a daughter's hand in marriage." The parlor erupted. Vivian stood so quickly she nearly knocked over her tea. Finally, I knew that party at the Hendersons would. He's asked for Joanna. Silence dropped like a stone into still water. Joanna felt the words hit her chest before her mind processed them. Someone wanted to marry her? That made no sense. She never went to parties, never attended socials. She hadn't been to a gathering outside this house in 2 years, not since her father had declared her too opinionated for polite company. I'm sorry, what? Vivian's voice had gone sharp and high. Charles read from the letter and Joanna watched his mouth move but barely heard the words. Something about meeting her last spring, about being impressed by her character, about building a life together in the valley. Last spring? She found her voice, rough from disuse in family conversations. I didn't go anywhere last spring. Don't you remember? Her mother's forehead creased with the effort of recollection. You went to town that day in March. There was that trouble with the old peddler in the market square. The memory surfaced like something from another life. She'd gone to purchase fabric for new kitchen curtains, using her own saved money, not that anyone had noticed. An old man had been selling trinkets from a cart when 3 of the town merchants surrounded him, accusing him of stealing a silver watch. The crowd had gathered, eager for entertainment, and someone had already fetched the constable. But Joanna had seen one of the merchants slip that watch into the old man's cart. She'd watched him do it, bold as brass, knowing no one would believe a traveling peddler over an established businessman. She'd stepped forward anyway. The argument that followed had been ugly. The merchants had called her hysterical, a troublemaker, too stupid to understand business. But Joanna had stood her ground, voice steady, pointing out every inconsistency in their story until even the constable had looked skeptical. When she'd demanded they check the merchant's coat pocket, where she'd seen him pocket the real watch, he'd run. The old man had wept and thanked her. The crowd had muttered and dispersed, embarrassed. Joanna had bought her fabric and walked home, arriving to a cold dinner and her father's lecture about making scenes in public. She'd never thought about it again. That troublemaker nonsense in the square. Charles waved his hand dismissively. Apparently Mr. Hale witnessed your little performance. He's written that he was impressed by my daughter's courage and moral character. He snorted. The man clearly has odd taste. This is absurd. Vivian's voice shook with fury. He can't possibly want her. She looks like a scullery maid. She has the social graces of a field horse. There must be some mistake. No mistake. Charles folded the letter. He was quite specific. Miss Joanna Whitmore, if she will have me. Elise started laughing, not polite laughter, the kind that bent her double, tears streaming down her face. Oh, this is rich. This is absolutely perfect. He wants the one we've been trying to marry off since she was 18, the one nobody would take. Elise, control yourself. But their mother's lips twitched with suppressed amusement. Joanna stood very still. She'd learned this technique years ago. Become a statue, show nothing, let the storm pass around you. But inside, something was beginning to crack. Well? Charles turned to her, eyebrows raised. What do you say to this extraordinary offer? What could she say? That her first instinct was suspicion because nothing good had ever come to her in this house? That she didn't even remember what this Gideon Hale looked like? That the idea of marrying a stranger terrified her almost as much as the idea of staying here forever? I don't know him, she said carefully. Oh, who cares about that? Vivian had recovered from her shock and now paced the room like a caged cat. You don't know anyone. You never go anywhere. At least this way you'll be someone else's problem. Vivian. Their mother's voice held a warning, but it was weak, half-hearted. What? We're all thinking it. Vivian spun to face Joanna directly. You're 23 years old. You dress like a servant. You spend your days managing the household because father won't let you do anything else. You have no prospects, no future, and frankly, you've become an embarrassment. This man is offering you a way out. You should be on your knees thanking him. The crack inside Joanna widened. He owns 12,000 acres, Charles said, studying the letter again. Profitable operation by all accounts. Good reputation, despite his rough background. No family to speak of. It would be an advantageous match, actually. Better than you deserve. Better than you deserve. Joanna had heard variations of this her entire life. Better than you deserve to wear that dress. Better than you deserve to attend that party. Better than you deserve to have opinions, dreams, a voice. He's probably desperate, Elise offered, dabbing at her eyes. Frontier men always are. Can't find wives up there in the wilderness, so they have to settle for whatever they can get. Lucky for you, Joanna. Your plainness won't matter so much when there's no one else around to compare you to. The isolation might suit her, their mother mused. She's never been comfortable in society anyway, all that unpleasantness with her opinions. They were talking about her like she wasn't there, like she was a piece of furniture they were trying to decide where to store. Of course, we'll need to provide a suitable trousseau, Charles continued. Can't have her arriving at the man's ranch looking like a beggar. He might change his mind and send her back. This triggered fresh laughter from Vivian and Elise. Can you imagine? Elise gasped. Returned like defective merchandise? I'd pay to see Father's face if that happened, Vivian added. Perhaps we should consider this more carefully, their mother said, though her tone suggested she'd already made up her mind. A rancher, Charles. It's so rustic. It's perfect, Charles countered. He's wealthy enough to be respectable, isolated enough that her eccentricities won't reflect poorly on us, and apparently willing to overlook her many flaws. I see no downside here. No downside for you, you mean? Joanna heard her own voice as if from a distance. You get rid of the daughter you've been ashamed of since I was 16. The room went quiet. Charles's face darkened. I beg your pardon? That's when it started, wasn't it? The words came now like water through a broken dam. When I disagreed with Councilman Porter at that dinner party, when I told him his plan to raise tenant rents was cruel and short-sighted. You apologized to him 17 times on the carriage ride home. I counted. You embarrassed me. I told the truth. His rents were already too high. People were suffering. But the truth was less important than appearances. So you decided I was the problem. Joanna's hands had curled into fists at her sides. Then it was easier to just keep me home, wasn't it? Make me useful in ways that didn't require you to be seen with me. How dare you? She's showing her true colors now, Vivian interrupted. This is exactly why she can't be allowed in society. No grace, no refinement, just that sharp tongue and those ridiculous principles. Ridiculous principles like honesty? Joanna turned to her sister. Like defending people who can't defend themselves? Like actually caring about something beyond dresses and gossip? Vivian's face flushed red. You sanctimonious little... Enough! Charles's voice cracked through the room. I have made my decision. You will accept Mr. Hale's proposal, Joanna. You will marry him, and you will do so with gratitude. This family has provided for you for 23 years despite your constant disappointments. The least you can do is agree to this without your usual dramatics. And if I refuse? The question hung in the air. Charles smiled, and it was not a kind expression. Then you're welcome to find your own way in the world. But you'll do so without a penny from this family, without references, without connections. Let's see how far your precious principles carry you when you're starving in a gutter somewhere. Joanna's mother looked away. Vivian and Elise watched with gleeful anticipation, hoping for a scene they could mock for weeks. And Joanna understood, finally and completely, that she had never been family to these people. She'd been an inconvenience, a problem to be solved. I need time to think, she managed. You have until tomorrow morning, Charles said. I'll be sending my reply to Mr. Hale then, with or without your agreement. But Joanna? He waited until she met his eyes. If you refuse this offer, you're making a choice. Remember that. She left the parlor on shaking legs, their laughter following her down the corridor, back through the servants' passages, up the narrow stairs to the tiny room under the eaves that had been hers since childhood. It had been the nursery once, when she was small. After her sisters had graduated to proper bedrooms, Joanna had stayed here. More space for Vivian's wardrobe, her mother had explained. More room for Elise's friends to visit. More evidence that Joanna didn't really belong. She sat on the narrow bed and stared at her hands, red and raw from work, calloused across the palms. These were not the hands of a daughter of the house. These were the hands of someone who scrubbed floors and hauled laundry and did all the work the family didn't want to pay servants to do. When had that happened? When had she stopped being a daughter and become free labor? She knew exactly when. The moment she'd become more trouble than she was worth to parade around society. The moment her father had realized she wouldn't stay quiet and decorative like her sisters. Joanna stood and moved to the small window. Below, the ground stretched out in manicured perfection. Gardens her mother had designed but never touched. Stables her father filled with horses he rarely rode. All that beauty maintained by people whose names her parents didn't know. She tried to know them, tried to learn their names, their stories, their struggles. That had been another mark against her. Too familiar with the help, her mother had complained, blurring social boundaries. A knock at the door made her turn. Mary entered with a tea tray, her expression troubled. "Thought you might need this, miss." "You heard?" "The whole house heard, I'd wager." Mary set the tray on the small table. Mr. Charles wasn't exactly keeping his voice down. Joanna sank into the room's single chair. "What do you know about Gideon Hale?" Mary's eyebrows rose. "You're seriously considering it?" "I don't know what I'm considering. What do you know?" The older woman settled onto the bed with a sigh. "Not much, truth be told. He keeps to himself mostly. Built his ranch from nothing, though. Everyone agrees on that. Started with a small plot and worked it until he could buy more. Now he's got one of the biggest operations in the valley." "Is he cruel?" "Never heard that said of him. Pays his workers fair from what I've gathered. Doesn't cheat at cards, doesn't drink to excess." Mary paused. "Doesn't talk much either. Quiet sort. Some say strange, but I think people just mean he's not like your typical rancher. Reads books, thinks before he speaks." "Why would a man like that want to marry someone he saw once in a market square?" "Why does anyone want anything, miss? Maybe he liked what he saw. Maybe he's tired of being alone." Mary's expression softened. "Or maybe he saw the same thing I see. A good woman being wasted by people too blind to appreciate her." Joanna felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "That's kind of you to say." "It's the truth. You think I don't notice how you slip extra food to the workers' children? How you've been teaching Jenny's daughter to read when no one's looking? How you stand up to your father when he tries to cut wages?" Mary reached over and squeezed Joanna's hand. "You're worth 10 of them downstairs, and that's my honest opinion." "Then why do I feel so worthless?" "Because they've been telling you that lie for so long, you started believing it." Mary stood. "But here's what I think. That rancher, he saw you stand up for what was right when everyone else stood by. Maybe he's looking for someone who won't back down when things get hard. Someone who sees the truth and speaks it. Someone like you." After Mary left, Joanna tried to sleep but couldn't. Her mind spun in circles, chasing questions with no good answers. She could refuse, take her chances in the world. But with no money, no references, no experience beyond household management, what kind of life could she build? She'd seen what happened to women alone in the world. She'd seen them begging in the streets of Millbrook, had watched them fade into workhouses or worse. She could accept. Marry a stranger. Move to a frontier valley far from everything she'd ever known. It would be a gamble, a leap into complete uncertainty. But at least it would be different than this. At least it would be a choice she made, not a sentence handed down. Around midnight, she heard them. She'd meant to stay in her room, but thirst drove her downstairs to the kitchen. She was approaching the parlor when she heard her father's voice, loud and slurred with whiskey. Perfect solution, really. Gets her out of the house, makes her someone else's problem. And the man actually seems grateful. Can you imagine? Her mother laughed, that tinkling sound she used at parties. "I do wonder what he'll think when he realizes what he's gotten himself into. All that moral superiority, all those opinions. Won't be our problem anymore." Vivian this time, acid sweet. Poor frontier bastard. He probably thinks he's getting a dutiful wife. Wait until she starts lecturing him about tenant rights or fair wages or whatever other nonsense catches her fancy. "Maybe the isolation will improve her," Elise suggested. "Nothing to do but keep house and have babies might finally make her useful." "We should send her with plenty of fabric," their mother said. "She's going to need to make her own clothes up there, and you know how she is. Probably show up at the ranch in that awful brown thing she was wearing today." More laughter. "I have to admit," Charles said, and Joanna could hear him refilling his glass, "I never thought we'd find anyone willing to take her. 3 years we've been trying to marry her off quietly, and nothing. Too plain, too outspoken, too strange. And then this rancher writes asking for her specifically. It's almost miraculous." "Should we tell him?" Elise asked. "About her disposition?" "Absolutely not. Let him figure it out on his own. By then she'll be legally his problem." I almost feel sorry for the man, Vivian said. Almost. But really, he made his choice. If he was foolish enough to propose to someone he saw once in a market square, he deserves what he gets. To Joanna's wedding, Charles announced, raising his glass. And to finally being rid of the burden. To being rid of the burden, they chorused. Joanna stood frozen in the hallway, the basket of laundry she'd been carrying trembling in her hands. She'd known they didn't love her. She'd known they were cruel. But hearing it laid out so plainly, the relief, the mockery, the complete absence of any affection, it burned through her like acid. They weren't even trying to hide it. They thought she was safely upstairs, too obedient to eavesdrop, too broken to care. They were wrong. Something inside Joanna Whitmore didn't just break in that moment. It transformed. Years of swallowed anger, of bitten back words, of pretending their cruelty didn't cut her, all of it crystallized into something hard and clear. They wanted her gone? Fine. She'd go. But not as the broken, grateful daughter they imagined. Not as someone who would fade quietly into obscurity while they congratulated themselves on solving their problem. She would leave. She would marry this stranger. She would build a life far from their poisonous influence. And she would never, ever come back. Joanna set down the laundry with careful precision. She walked back up the servants' stairs to her room and pulled out a sheet of writing paper, the cheap kind they gave servants, not the fine stationery her sisters used. "Dear Mr. Hale," she wrote in her clear, practical hand, "my father has informed me of your proposal. I accept your offer of marriage with the following understanding. I come to you with no illusions about myself. I am not beautiful. I am not accomplished in the ways society typically values. I am practical, opinionated, and have been told I possess too much pride and too little grace. What I can offer is honesty, hard work, and a willingness to build a life in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. If these qualities are acceptable to you, then yes, I will marry you. I should also tell you that my family does not value me, and I do not expect you to either. I'm accepting this proposal because it offers me a future that is mine to shape, not because I believe in romantic fantasies. If you are seeking a devoted wife who will gaze at you with adoration, you have chosen poorly. But if you want a partner who will speak truthfully and work honestly, then perhaps we will suit each other after all. Respectfully, Joanna Whitmore." She sealed the letter before she could reconsider, then lay back on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow morning, she would give it to her father to send. Tomorrow, her life would change forever. And those people downstairs, the ones who'd raised her to believe she was worthless, they would never touch her again. In the darkest hour before dawn, Joanna finally slept. She dreamed of mountains she'd never seen, of wide valleys under endless sky, of a life where her worth wasn't measured by her beauty or her silence. She dreamed of freedom. And for the first time in years, she woke up with something that felt dangerously like hope. The reply came faster than Joanna expected. 3 days after her father had posted her letter, along with his own far more effusive response that made her skin crawl with its false warmth, a messenger arrived with Gideon Hale's answer. Charles read it first, his eyebrows climbing higher with each line, then handed it to Joanna without comment. "Miss Whitmore, your honesty is more valuable to me than all the accomplishments in the world. I don't want adoration. I want a partner who sees things clearly and isn't afraid to say so. That's rare enough to be worth everything else. I'll arrive in 2 weeks to collect you, if that suits. Bring whatever matters to you. Leave the rest behind. Gideon Hale." "Well," her father said, clearing his throat, "he seems direct." "He seems perfect for her," Vivian muttered from across the breakfast table, both equally lacking in social grace. Joanna folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She felt strange, not happy exactly, but something close to calm. A decision had been made. The wheels were in motion. There was relief in that, even if everything else remained uncertain. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation that felt more like punishment than celebration. Her mother ordered a trousseau assembled, but the items chosen were all practical to the point of insult. Heavy cotton dresses in drab colors, thick stockings, plain underthings that might as well have been burlap. Nothing beautiful, nothing fine. "You're going to a ranch, not a ballroom," her mother explained when Joanna fingered a bolt of pale blue fabric in the dressmaker's shop. "These will be more appropriate." more appropriate. Code for, you don't deserve anything lovely. Joanna stopped arguing. She took the ugly dresses and the scratchy shawls and the serviceable boots that would have made Vivian weep. She packed them in a battered trunk that had belonged to some long-dead relative, along with the few personal items she'd accumulated over the years. A book of poetry she'd bought with her own saved coins, a pressed flower from the garden, a letter from Mary wishing her well. Her sisters didn't help. They spent those 2 weeks planning a farewell party, not for Joanna, but for themselves. A celebration of finally having the house to themselves, they said. An end to the awkwardness of explaining their odd younger sister to visitors. You understand we can't actually invite you, Elise told her on the morning of the party. It would be too depressing. Everyone asking about your upcoming marriage, having to explain about the rancher. You know how it is. Joanna knew exactly how it was. The night before Gideon was set to arrive, she couldn't sleep. She stood at her window watching the party below, the lanterns strung through the garden, the music drifting up, the laughter of people who'd never once asked her name. Tomorrow she'd leave all of this behind. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt light. Miss Joanna? Mary knocked softly and entered with a package wrapped in brown paper. I wanted to give you this before tomorrow gets away from us. Inside was a shawl, hand-knitted in soft gray wool with delicate blue flowers worked into the pattern. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever made for Joanna. Mary, I can't. You can and you will. Took me 4 months working by candlelight after my shift. Mary's voice was gruff. Figured you'd need something pretty up there in those mountains. Something to remind you that not everyone here thought you were worthless. Joanna hugged her, this woman who'd shown her more motherly affection in 2 years than her own mother had in 23. They stood there in the tiny attic room while the party sparkled below, 2 women the Whitmores had never properly seen, sharing a moment of genuine warmth. You're going to be all right, Mary whispered. Better than all right. You're going to be free. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Joanna woke before dawn and dressed in one of her new traveling outfits. A brown wool dress with a high collar and long sleeves, sensible and ugly and everything her mother thought appropriate for a rancher's wife. She braided her dark hair tightly and pinned it at the nape of her neck. In the mirror, she looked like exactly what she was, a woman going to work, not to a wedding. The house was silent except for the servants cleaning up from last night's party. Joanna carried her trunk down the servants' stairs herself, refusing to wake anyone for help. She'd hauled heavier loads before. In the kitchen, she found Mary already up, making tea. Thought you might want something warm before the journey, Mary said, pouring a cup. It's a long way to the valley. They sat together in companionable silence, 2 women who'd learned that sometimes quiet understanding meant more than words. When Joanna finished her tea, Mary walked with her to the front entrance, not the servants' door, but the main entrance. A small rebellion, but it mattered. Hold your head up, Mary said, squeezing her hand one last time. You're worth more than they ever knew. The sun was just cresting the horizon when Joanna heard the carriage. Not the fancy kind that brought visitors to the Whitmore mansion, but a sturdy wagon built for distance and rough roads. The horses were big work animals, not showpieces. Everything about it was practical. Everything about it was honest. The man who climbed down from the driver's seat was tall, taller than Joanna had expected, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they'd worked every day of his life. He wore dark trousers and a worn jacket, a hat pulled low against the morning sun. His face was weathered and serious, carved into hard lines by wind and work. He looked nothing like the men who'd courted her sisters, those soft-handed society boys with their practiced smiles and empty compliments. Gideon Hale looked real. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at her. His eyes were gray, she noticed, the color of storm clouds or river stones. They studied her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. Miss Whitmore, he said. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, rougher, a voice that didn't waste words. Mr. Hale, your trunk ready? Yes. He climbed the steps and lifted it like it weighed nothing, carrying it to the wagon and securing it in the back. Joanna watched his movements, efficient, practiced, no wasted motion. This was a man who'd learned to work alone. The front door opened behind her. Her father emerged, still in his dressing gown, hair disheveled from sleep. He'd clearly been woken by the sound of the wagon. Hale, he said, forcing joviality into his voice. Good to see you. Come in, come in. Have breakfast before you leave. It's a long journey. We'll eat on the road, Gideon said without looking at him. He turned to Joanna. Unless you need more time. She thought about going back inside that house, sitting at that breakfast table while her family made false pleasantries and hid their relief, enduring one more meal of being invisible. I'm ready now. Something flickered in Gideon's eyes. Approval, maybe, or understanding. He held out his hand to help her into the wagon. His palm was calloused and warm, solid. Now wait just a moment, Charles blustered down the steps. Surely you'll stay for... Your daughter said she's ready. Gideon's voice didn't rise, but something in it made Charles stop talking. I take her at her word. He climbed up beside Joanna and took the reins. The horses shifted, ready to move. Joanna! Her mother appeared in the doorway now, wrapped in a silk robe. You can't just leave without saying goodbye properly. What will people think? Joanna looked at the woman who'd birthed her but never really seen her. Tell people whatever you like. You always have. Her mother's face went red. Behind her, Vivian and Elise appeared, drawn by the commotion. They looked ridiculous in their night clothes, hair in rags, faces puffy from sleep and too much champagne. This is incredibly rude, Vivian snapped. Even for you. Safe travels, Joanna said flatly. Gideon made a sound that might have been a laugh. He clicked to the horses and they moved forward, down the long drive away from the white mansion on the hill. Joanna didn't look back. They rode in silence for the first hour. The road took them through Millbrook, still quiet in the early morning, then out into open country. Farmland gave way to forest, forest to hills. The wagon rocked gently over ruts and stones, and Joanna gripped the seat to keep her balance. Finally, Gideon spoke. You want to stop? Stretch your legs? I'm fine. It's a 3-day journey to the valley. You don't have to pretend you're made of iron. Joanna glanced at him. His profile was hard to read, all angles and shadows under his hat. I'm not pretending. I'm used to work. I noticed. He gestured to her hands, red and roughened even though she'd tried to soften them with Mary's salve. Those aren't society hands. No, they're not. Good. I don't need society hands. I need someone who won't faint at the sight of honest work. The directness of it caught her off guard. No flowery language, no pretense, just truth laid out plain. Is that why you chose me? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Because I looked like I could work? Gideon was quiet for a long moment. The horses plodded steadily forward, their hooves a rhythmic beat against packed dirt. I chose you, he said finally, because you stood up for that old man when everyone else walked by. Because you spoke truth even when it cost you. Because you saw something wrong and couldn't stay quiet about it. He turned to look at her then, those storm-gray eyes direct and searching. That's rare. Rarer than beauty or manners or any of the things people usually value. I saw that in you, and I knew. Knew what? That you were someone worth knowing. Joanna felt something crack in her chest, not breaking, opening. She looked away quickly, blinking against sudden moisture in her eyes. You saw me once, she said, voice rough. In a market square. For 10 minutes. You don't know me. No, he agreed, but I know what matters in a person, and I saw enough to want to know more. He paused. Your letter confirmed it. My letter was hardly flattering. It was honest. That's better than flattering. Gideon shifted the reins to one hand and reached into his jacket, pulling out her letter, worn at the edges like he'd read it multiple times. You told me straight that you're not beautiful or accomplished, that your family doesn't value you, and you don't expect me to either. You think that pushed me away? Didn't it? It made me sure. Because most people would have lied, would have dressed themselves up in pretty words and false promises. You gave me truth. That's what I need in a partner, someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong, when an idea won't work, when there's a better way. He tucked the letter back in his jacket. The valley's hard country, Miss Whitmore. It doesn't care about pretty lies. It requires truth. They stopped for lunch beside a creek, the horses drinking while Gideon unpacked bread and cheese and dried apples from a saddlebag. They ate sitting on a fallen log, watching the water flow past. Tell me about the ranch, Joanna said. So he did. and for the first time she heard something other than flat practicality in his voice. He talked about the land like it was alive, the way the light hit the valley at sunset, turning everything gold. The meadows that flooded with wildflowers every spring, the creek that ran year-round, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. He'd built his house from timber he'd cut himself, positioned to catch the morning sun and the evening breeze. The barn was newer, bigger than the house, because the livestock came first in ranching country. Sounds isolated, Joanna said. It is. Nearest neighbor's 5 miles, town's 15. He glanced at her. That bother you? No. She meant it. I've been surrounded by people my whole life and felt alone anyway. Maybe real isolation will be better. Gideon nodded slowly like she'd just confirmed something he'd suspected. The workers live in cabins on the property. Good people, most of them. Keep to themselves unless there's trouble. How many? 8 full-time, more during branding and harvest seasons. Joanna did quick math in her head. You feed them? Part of their wage. Why? Just thinking about provisions. How much food you'd need to keep on hand. How often you go to town for supplies. Something that might have been a smile tugged at Gideon's mouth. Once a month, usually, but I'm guessing that's about to change. Why? Because you're already thinking about how to do it better. He was right, and they both knew it. Joanna had spent years managing a household. She couldn't turn that off just because the household had changed. They reached an inn at nightfall, a rough establishment that catered to travelers heading into the frontier territories. Gideon secured 2 rooms without being asked, which Joanna appreciated. He might be her future husband, but they were still strangers. Breakfast at dawn, he said, handing her a key. We'll make good time tomorrow if the weather holds. In her small room, Joanna unpacked Mary's shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders. The walls were thin enough that she could hear other travelers talking, laughing, living their lives. She sat on the narrow bed and realized she hadn't thought about her family once since they'd left Millbrook. The relief of that was staggering. The second day brought rain, not a downpour, but a steady drizzle that turned the roads muddy and made the going slow. Gideon produced an oilcloth coat from somewhere and handed it to Joanna without comment. It was far too big, but it kept her dry. Tell me about your family, she said, as they navigated a particularly rutted section of road. Not much to tell. Parents died when I was young, grew up working other people's ranches, saved my wages, bought my own land when I turned 22. Been building it ever since. No siblings. Had a sister. She died of fever when she was 6. His voice was flat, the way people sounded when talking about old pain they'd learned to carry. Just me now. I'm sorry. Long time ago. He was quiet for a moment. What about yours? Your family? Joanna laughed, but there was no humor in it. You saw them. That's about all there is to see. They treated you badly. It wasn't a question. Somehow he'd already known. They treated me like what I was, Joanna said carefully. A disappointment, a burden, something to be managed and eventually disposed of. That why you accepted my proposal? To escape? The question was blunt but not unkind. Joanna considered lying, then remembered what he'd said about valuing honesty. Partly. But also because you offered me a choice. You said in your letter I could bring what matters and leave the rest behind. Do you know how long it's been since someone gave me a choice about anything? Gideon's jaw tightened. They controlled you. They owned me. There's a difference. Joanna pulled the coat tighter against a gust of wind. My father decided I was too opinionated for society, so he made me useful in other ways. Managing the household, overseeing the servants, doing all the work my mother didn't want to bother with. I became unpaid labor dressed up as family duty. And you let them. The question stung because it touched on something Joanna had asked herself 1,000 times. What choice did I have? I had no money of my own, no way to leave. If I'd run, they would have found me and brought me back. If I'd refused to work, they would have thrown me out with nothing. She met his eyes. Don't mistake survival for weakness. I did what I had to do to make it through. Wasn't criticizing, was asking. Gideon studied her face. You strike me as someone who'd fight back if given half a chance. I did fight back, just not the way you're thinking. Joanna felt the old anger rise in her throat. I fought back by speaking truth when everyone wanted pretty lies, by defending people who couldn't defend themselves, by refusing to become like them, no matter how hard they tried to break me down. That's fighting too. Yes, Gideon said quietly. It is. They stopped that night at another inn, rougher than the first. The rain had intensified, and the common room was crowded with travelers waiting for better weather. Gideon found them seats near the fire and ordered food, stew that was mostly potatoes but warm enough to matter. A group of men at the next table were talking loudly, their voices carrying over the general noise. Telling you, old Henderson's losing his land, banks foreclosing next month. His own fault. Should have paid his debts. Debts he wouldn't have if the bank hadn't raised his rates 3 times in 2 years. Man can't make a living when the terms keep changing. Joanna's fingers tightened on her spoon. Gideon noticed. You know Henderson? He asked. No, but I know that story. I've heard it 100 times in different variations. She stared into her stew. Someone powerful changes the rules and regular people suffer for it, and everyone just accepts it as the natural order. You don't accept it. No, I don't. She looked up at him. Does that bother you? That I care about things that don't directly affect me? Why would it bother me? It bothered my family. They said I was too concerned with other people's problems, that I should focus on my own position and stop making trouble. Gideon's expression hardened. Your family was wrong about a lot of things. One of the men from the next table turned around, clearly having overheard. He was older, weathered, with the look of someone who'd worked outdoors his whole life. Pardon me for interrupting, miss, but you sound like you understand the problem. Henderson's not a bad man. He works hard. But the bank? The man shook his head. They don't care about hard work. They care about profit. Have you talked to the Territorial Land Office? Joanna asked. If the rate increases weren't properly documented, or if they violated the original loan terms, there might be grounds to contest the foreclosure. The man blinked. I hadn't thought of that. Also, check if Henderson has any witnesses to the original agreement. Sometimes these things come down to whose word counts more in court. If he can prove the bank acted in bad faith. She trailed off, realizing the entire table was staring at her. You a lawyer or something? One of them asked. No, just someone who pays attention. Joanna felt her face heat. Sorry, I shouldn't have. Don't apologize, Gideon said firmly. He looked at the men. She's right. Henderson should check those things before he gives up. The older man nodded slowly. I'll tell him. Thank you, miss. And you, sir. After they left, Gideon was quiet for a long moment. What? Joanna finally asked. That's why I chose you, he said simply. Right there. Most people would have kept their heads down, minded their own business. You can't help yourself. You hear about an injustice, and you have to try to fix it. You say that like it's a good thing. My family thought it was a character flaw. Your family was made up of fools. Gideon's voice was hard. The valley needs people who give a damn about fairness, about doing what's right. We're building something out there, and it won't mean anything if it's built on the backs of people getting cheated. Joanna stared at him. You really believe that? I do, and I think you do too. That's why we'll work. That night, lying in another unfamiliar bed listening to rain hammer the roof, Joanna thought about that word. Work. Not love, not romance. Not any of the things her sisters had dreamed about in their marriages. Work. Somehow, that felt more honest than all the poetry in the world. The third day dawned clear and cold. They left early, pushing hard because Gideon wanted to reach the valley before dark. The landscape changed as they climbed higher. Fewer farms, more wilderness. Pine forests thick with shadows. Mountain peaks visible in the distance, still snow-capped despite the lateness of spring. Almost there, Gideon said as they crested a ridge. And there it was. The valley spread out below them like something from a dream Joanna hadn't known she was having. Wide and green, cut through by a silver ribbon of creek. She could see the ranch house in the distance, a solid structure of timber and stone, smoke rising from its chimney. The barn behind it was massive, red paint bright against the landscape. Fields stretched out in neat patterns, and she could just make out small figures moving among what must be cattle. It was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with decoration or design. It was beautiful because it was real, built by hand, earned through work. That's home, Gideon said quietly. Home. The word settled into Joanna's chest, foreign but not unwelcome. They descended into the valley as the sun moved toward the horizon, painting everything gold just like Gideon had described. Workers looked up from their tasks as the wagon passed, their faces curious but not unfriendly. A few raised hands in greeting. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. It was bigger than Joanna had expected, 2 stories with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Sturdy, built to last. "It's not fancy," Gideon said, and for the first time since she'd met him, he sounded uncertain. "I built it for function, not show." "It's perfect," Joanna said, and meant it. He helped her down from the wagon, and this time his hand lingered on hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition, understanding, the beginning of something that might grow into more. The front door opened and an older woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. She had gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. "This is Mrs. Chen," Gideon said. "She manages the house when I'm away, keeps everything running." "So you're the one," Mrs. Chen said, looking Joanna up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who'd seen plenty in her life. "He's been nervous as a cat all week, getting ready for you." "I have not," Gideon said, but his ears went red. Mrs. Chen snorted. "Cleaned the house top to bottom, twice. Fixed that squeaky step on the stairs, brought in fresh flowers for your room, but sure, not nervous at all." Joanna felt something warm unfold in her chest. He'd prepared for her, cared about making her welcome. "Come on," Mrs. Chen said, gesturing them inside. "I've got dinner ready, and you both look half frozen." The interior of the house was as honest as the exterior. Wood floors, simple furniture built for comfort rather than show. But there were books, shelves of them lining one wall of what appeared to be a sitting room. And the kitchen was large and well-equipped, clearly designed by someone who understood the work that went into feeding people. Mrs. Chen had prepared a feast. Roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, vegetables from what must be an early garden. They ate at a scarred wooden table that had clearly seen years of use, and Joanna found herself relaxing for the first time in days. "You'll want to see your room," Mrs. Chen said after dinner. "It's upstairs, second door on the right. Gideon's is at the end of the hall. You'll have your privacy until you decide otherwise." The casualness of it, the lack of judgment, nearly undid Joanna. In her parents' world, such an arrangement would have been scandalous. Here, it was simply practical. Her room was simple but clean, a bed, a wardrobe, a small desk by the window. And on the desk, a jar of wildflowers, their petals still bright. Gideon appeared in the doorway, carrying her trunk. "Thought you might want this tonight. Get settled in." He set it down and turned to leave, but Joanna stopped him. "Thank you," she said, "for the flowers, for all of this." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Wanted you to feel welcome. This is your home now, same as mine." "Is it?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended. "Your home, I mean. Do you actually want me here, or did you just need help running the ranch?" Gideon turned back to face her fully. In the lamplight, his features looked softer, less carved from stone. "I could have hired help if that's all I needed," he said. "I asked you here because I wanted a partner, someone to build something with, someone who sees the world the way I do, full of work that matters and problems worth solving and people worth fighting for." He paused. "I won't lie to you and say I'm good at talking about feelings. I'm not. But I meant what I wrote in my letter. You're someone worth knowing, and I'd like the chance to prove I'm worth knowing too." Joanna's throat tightened. "You already have." They stood there in the doorway, 2 people who'd been alone for different reasons, finding something unexpected in each other. It wasn't the romance her sisters had dreamed of. It was better. It was real. Joanna woke to unfamiliar sounds. Cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of the house settling, wind moving through pine trees. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory flooded back, and with it, a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. She was here, in the valley, in Gideon Hale's house. Her house now, too, supposedly. Gray dawn light filtered through the curtains. She dressed quickly in one of the practical dresses her mother had chosen, then made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, but she could smell coffee, which meant someone was already awake. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Chen at the stove, frying eggs and bacon. "Morning," the older woman said without turning around. "Coffee's on the table." Gideon's already out with the cattle. Man doesn't believe in sleeping past sunrise. Joanna poured herself a cup and sat at the table, cradling the warmth between her palms. What time does he usually come back? Depends on what needs doing. Could be an hour, could be 3. Mrs. Chen slid eggs onto a plate and brought it over. Eat. You look half-starved. I'm fine. That wasn't a suggestion. Mrs. Chen sat down across from her with her own plate. Now, we should talk about how things work around here. I run the house, cooking, cleaning, managing supplies. Been doing it for 2 years, and I'm good at it. I don't need supervision, and I don't appreciate interference. The bluntness was refreshing after years of her mother's passive-aggressive instructions. That's fair, Joanna said. But Mrs. Chen continued, I'm getting old. My knees hurt. My back's not what it was. If you want to help, I won't say no. Just don't come in here thinking you're going to take over because you're the wife now. I wouldn't dream of it. Mrs. Chen studied her for a long moment. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone soft. Someone who'd last maybe a week before running back to civilization crying. The older woman bit into her bacon. But you've got work hands, and you didn't flinch when you saw how far we are from anywhere, so maybe you'll surprise me. Joanna thought about all the surprises she'd been told she was. Unpleasant ones, according to her family. Maybe here, surprising people would be different. After breakfast, Mrs. Chen showed her around the house properly. It was larger than it had seemed the night before. 4 bedrooms upstairs, the kitchen and sitting room downstairs, plus a small office where Gideon kept his ranch records. Everything was clean but worn, used hard, and maintained carefully. He built most of this himself, Mrs. Chen said, running her hand along a door frame. Had help with the barn, but the house was all him. Took him 3 years. It's solid work. He's a solid man. Doesn't talk much, doesn't show much, but what he does show is real. Mrs. Chen glanced at her. You could do worse. I know. Do you? Because you've got that look about you, like you're waiting for the other boot to drop, like you don't quite believe this is real. Joanna's fingers tightened on her coffee cup. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been paying attention. Mrs. Chen's voice softened slightly. Whatever happened to you before you came here, it's not happening anymore. Gideon's not the kind of man who lies or plays games. If he says something, he means it. If he promised you a home, that's what you've got. Joanna wanted to believe that. She just didn't know how yet. Gideon returned around mid-morning, boots muddy, and hat pushed back on his head. He looked surprised to find Joanna in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Chen prepare lunch. You don't have to work, he said. Not today. You just got here. I know, Joanna continued chopping vegetables. But I don't know what else to do with myself, and Mrs. Chen says she won't turn down help. Stubborn woman, Mrs. Chen muttered, but there was approval in her voice. Gideon leaned against the doorframe, watching them. There's a workers' meeting after lunch. You should come. Meet everyone properly. Do you want me there, or are you just being polite? I want you there. You'll be working with these people same as me. They should know who you are. The meeting took place in the barn, where 8 men and 2 women gathered in a loose circle. They ranged in age from a boy who couldn't have been more than 17 to a grizzled man in his 50s. All of them had the weathered look of people who worked outside in all seasons. Gideon made quick introductions. Joanna tried to remember all the names: Tom, Marcus, James, young Billy, Sarah, and her husband Daniel, old Pete, Carlos, and 2 brothers named Jack and Henry. They nodded at her with varying degrees of curiosity and reservation. We've got a water problem, Gideon said without preamble. South pasture's running dry faster than it should. Creek's flowing fine, but something's not right with the irrigation channels. Could be blocked somewhere, Marcus suggested. Debris buildup. Already checked. Channels are clear. Maybe the slope's wrong, Tom said. Water's running off before it soaks in. They debated back and forth for several minutes, each man offering theories. Joanna listened carefully, building a picture of the problem in her mind. She'd never worked with irrigation before, but she understood systems, and this sounded like a system with a flaw in its design. Can I see it? She asked. Everyone turned to look at her. Gideon raised an eyebrow. See what? The south pasture, the irrigation channels, the whole setup. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. All right. Tom, Marcus, come with us. They walked out to the south pasture. Joanna picking her way carefully over uneven ground in boots that weren't quite broken in yet. The land sloped gently downward, and she could see the irrigation channels Gideon had mentioned, shallow ditches meant to carry water from the creek to the grazing areas. She crouched down at the highest point, studying the angle of the channels. Then she walked the length of one, noting how the water flowed, or rather, how it didn't flow quite right. "Your slope's fine," she said finally, "but your distribution's wrong. You're trying to run water through one main channel and branch off from there, but by the time it reaches the far end, there's not enough pressure. The first branches are taking most of the flow." Marcus scratched his head. "So what do we do? Dig new channels?" "No. You need a series of smaller channels, all fed from the main creek at intervals. Distribute the water at the source instead of trying to push it all through one line." She traced the pattern in the dirt with a stick. "Like this. 5 or 6 intake points instead of one. Each feeds a smaller area so the pressure stays consistent." Tom leaned in to look at her diagram. "That might actually work." "It will work," Joanna said with more confidence than she felt. "It's the same principle as the gravity-fed water system we used for the kitchen gardens back." She stopped herself. Back home wasn't home anymore. Back in Millbrook. Gideon was watching her with that intense focus she was beginning to recognize. "How long would it take to set up?" "Depends on how many people you have working on it, and whether you hit rock when you're digging." "We start tomorrow," he decided. "Tom, Marcus, get Billy, and the others. This is priority." After they left, Gideon turned to Joanna. "You sure about this? If we dig those channels and it doesn't work, we've wasted a week of labor." "I'm sure." "Why?" "Because I understand how water moves, and because your current system has a basic design flaw that no amount of maintenance will fix." She met his eyes. "You asked me here to be a partner. Partners point out problems and solve them. That's what I'm doing." Something that might have been pride flickered across his face. "All right then. Let's see if you're as smart as I think you are." Say, the next week was harder than anything Joanna had experienced in her life, and she'd scrubbed floors until her hands bled. The work was different, outside in the sun and wind, digging trenches in soil that turned rocky without warning, hauling buckets of stones to line the new channels. Her back screamed, her shoulders ached, blisters formed on her palms despite the work gloves Gideon insisted she wear. But she kept going. The ranch hands watched her with undisguised skepticism the first day. By the third day, that skepticism had shifted into grudging respect. She worked as hard as any of them, never complained, and when someone suggested a modification to her design, she listened and adjusted if it made sense. "You're all right," young Billy told her one afternoon, collapsing beside her during a water break. "For a lady from the city." "Millbrook's hardly a city." "It's more city than here," he grinned. "And you don't act like other ladies I've met. They wouldn't be caught dead digging ditches." "Then they're missing out. Digging ditches is very satisfying when you're angry." Billy laughed. "What have you got to be angry about?" Everything, Joanna thought. Years of being dismissed and diminished and treated like she was worth less than the furniture. But instead she said, "Nothing specific, just general principle." Gideon worked alongside them, which surprised her. She'd expected him to supervise from a distance the way her father had always done. But he was in the trenches with his workers, shirt soaked with sweat, hauling rocks and moving earth. When they uncovered a particularly stubborn boulder, he was the one who figured out how to lever it free. "You don't have to do this," Marcus told him. "We can handle it." "I know, but it goes faster with everyone working." At night, Joanna barely had energy to eat dinner before dragging herself upstairs. She'd fall asleep the moment her head hit the pillow, too exhausted even to dream. On the 5th day, they opened the new channels and let the water flow. It worked. Water spread evenly across the entire south pasture, soaking into the ground exactly as it should. The dry patches disappeared within hours. The cattle, who'd been avoiding the area, drifted back to graze. Tom let out a whoop. Billy did a little dance. Even Marcus cracked a smile. Gideon stood beside Joanna, watching the water flow through the channels she'd designed. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. She could see the satisfaction in his face, the relief. "Told you I was sure," she said. "Yeah, you did." He turned to her. "That brain of yours is going to be dangerous around here." "Good dangerous or bad dangerous?" Good. Definitely good. That night, Mrs. Chen made a celebration dinner, roast beef and potatoes, and a pie made with preserved cherries from last year's harvest. The ranch hands were invited, and the kitchen table wasn't big enough for everyone, so they spread out into the sitting room, balancing plates on their laps. It was loud and chaotic, and nothing like the formal dinners Joanna had endured at her parents' house. These people actually talked to each other, joked, argued about whose idea had been better during the digging. Sarah's husband, Daniel, challenged Tom to an arm wrestling match. Billy told a story about a rattlesnake that had everyone laughing. And for the first time in her life, Joanna felt like she belonged somewhere. Later, after everyone had gone back to their cabins and Mrs. Chen had retired to her room, Joanna found herself alone with Gideon on the front porch. The night was cool, stars scattered across the sky like someone had spilled salt. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For letting me try. For trusting my idea even though you barely know me. For not treating me like I'm stupid." Gideon was silent for a moment. "Why would I treat you like you're stupid when you've already proven you're not?" "Because that's what people do. They assume women don't understand practical things like irrigation and engineering. They pat you on the head and tell you not to worry about it. Then those people are fools." He shifted in his chair. "I've known plenty of men who couldn't design their way out of a paper bag. And I've known women who could run circles around them. Smart is smart, regardless of what form it comes in." Joanna looked at him, really looked at him. In the lamplight spilling from the window, his profile was all hard angles, but there was something gentle in the way he held himself, something careful. "Your family really did a number on you," he said, still staring out at the darkness. "Didn't they? What makes you say that?" "Because you thank me for basic decency. Because you're surprised when people listen to your ideas. Because you work yourself half to death trying to prove you're worth keeping around." He turned to face her. "You don't have to prove anything here. You already belong." The words hit her harder than any insult her family had ever thrown. She felt her throat tighten, her eyes burn. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "How to just be, without constantly worrying that I'm one mistake away from being thrown out." "You practice, make mistakes, see that you don't get thrown out, and eventually your brain catches up to the reality." Gideon's voice was rough. "It takes time. I'm not going anywhere." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds. Cattle settling down, an owl calling in the distance, the wind moving through the pines. "I should tell you," Gideon said eventually, "I'm not good at this either. The talking part, the feelings part. I've noticed. I'm better with work, with doing. If you need something fixed or built or figured out, I'm your man. But if you need sweet words and romance, I'm probably going to disappoint you." Joanna almost laughed. "I don't need sweet words. I've heard enough pretty lies to last a lifetime. I'd rather have someone who says what they mean, even if it comes out clumsy." "Then we might be all right together?" "Might be," she agreed. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm Joanna had never experienced before. She woke with the sun, helped Mrs. Chen with breakfast, then spent her days working on whatever needed attention. Sometimes that meant helping in the kitchen gardens Mrs. Chen had started behind the house. Sometimes it meant riding out with Gideon to check on the cattle, learning to read the signs of healthy livestock versus animals that needed attention. Sometimes it meant poring over the ranch account books, finding inefficiencies in supply ordering that were costing them money. She learned the names of all the workers' children, 8 of them in total, ranging from Sarah's baby boy to Jack's daughter, who was nearly 12. She learned which families needed help and which were too proud to ask for it. She learned that old Pete had a bad hip he was hiding because he couldn't afford to lose his job, and she convinced Gideon to adjust his duties without making it obvious. The ranch hands stopped treating her like a visitor and started treating her like she was part of the operation. They'd ask her opinion on things, come to her when they had problems, include her in their rough humor. Marcus started calling her boss lady, which made Gideon roll his eyes but never correct him. One afternoon, Sarah approached her while she was hanging laundry. "Can I talk to you about something?" Sarah's voice was hesitant. "Of course. It's about the children. Billy's been teaching them some, but he's not much educated himself. They can barely read, can't write worth a damn, and there's no school within 20 miles. Sarah twisted her hands together. "I was wondering, could you maybe teach them? Just basic things, I know you're busy, but yes, Joanna said immediately. Sarah blinked. Yes? Just like that? Just like that? When do you want to start? They set up a makeshift classroom in the barn, using crates for seats and a piece of slate someone found in storage. Joanna taught for an hour every afternoon, reading, writing, basic arithmetic. The children were eager and bright, soaking up knowledge like dry earth soaking up rain. Gideon found her there one day, watching through the barn door as she helped Jack's daughter sound out a difficult word. You didn't tell me you were doing this, he said afterward. Joanna tensed, expecting criticism. Sarah asked, and I thought, I think it's good, really good. He ran a hand through his hair. I've been wanting to do something about the education situation, but I didn't know how. This is perfect. You're not angry? Why would I be angry? Because I didn't ask permission first. Because I'm using barn space. Because... Joanna? He caught her hand, stopping the flow of words. You're my partner. You don't need permission to do good things. The barn's as much yours as mine, and those kids deserve a chance to learn. I'm grateful you're giving it to them. She stared at their joined hands, his calloused and strong, hers roughened by work but still smaller. I'm not used to this. I know, but you will be. As summer deepened into early fall, something shifted between them. It was nothing dramatic, no single moment Joanna could point to, but gradually she became aware of Gideon in ways she hadn't before. The way he moved when he worked, economical and sure. The rare smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. The careful way he treated the animals, gentle despite his size and strength. She caught herself watching him during dinner, noting the way lamplight caught in his dark hair, wondering what it would be like to reach across the table and touch his hand the way he'd touched hers. The realization that she was falling for him came quietly, without fanfare. One evening, they were reviewing the account books together, their chairs pulled close so they could both see the ledger. Gideon was explaining something about cattle prices, his finger tracing down a column of numbers, and Joanna found herself not listening to the words but watching his mouth as he spoke. When he glanced up and caught her staring, she felt heat flood her face. What? He asked. Nothing, I was just thinking. About cattle prices? Sure, cattle prices. His eyes narrowed slightly, that perceptive gaze seeing more than she wanted to reveal. But he didn't push, just went back to the ledger. Later that night, she lay in bed and admitted to herself what she'd been avoiding. She cared about him, more than cared. This quiet, serious man who treated her like she mattered, who trusted her judgment, who'd given her a place where she could finally be herself. She was falling in love with him. The thought terrified her. Because what if he didn't feel the same? What if he really had just wanted a practical partner, someone to help run the ranch? What if she'd mistaken kindness and respect for something deeper? She couldn't risk it, couldn't risk the fragile stability she'd found here by wanting more than he was willing to give. So she kept it to herself, this growing feeling that made her heart race when he smiled at her across the dinner table. She buried it deep and tried to be content with what she had, which was already more than she'd ever expected to have. But one night in late September, everything changed. They'd been working late in the south pasture, reinforcing one of the irrigation channels that had developed a weak spot. The sun had set an hour ago, and they were finishing by lantern light when Joanna slipped on wet grass. Gideon caught her before she fell, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her against his chest. For a moment they stood frozen, her back pressed to his front, his breath warm against her ear. You all right? His voice was rough. Yes, I'm fine. She turned to look up at him and found his face closer than she'd expected. Close enough to see the scar through his left eyebrow she'd never noticed before. Close enough to count his eyelashes if she'd wanted to. Close enough to kiss. Neither of them moved. The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows across his features. Joanna could hear her own heartbeat, loud and fast. I should let you go, Gideon said, but he didn't move. Yes, you should. Still neither of them moved. Joanna. Her name came out like a confession. I need to tell you something. What? This wasn't supposed to happen. His arms tightened slightly around her. I thought I could keep it practical. Partnership, respect, nothing more complicated than that. But He stopped, jaw working like the words were fighting him. You what? I'm falling for you. Hell, maybe I've already fallen, and I don't know what to do about it because this wasn't the deal we made." Joanna's breath caught. "What was the deal we made?" "Honest partnership. No expectations beyond respect and shared work. I didn't want to trap you into something you didn't want. Didn't want you to feel obligated to—" She kissed him. It wasn't graceful or practiced. She had to stretch up on her toes to reach him, and her angle was all wrong, and she probably should have warned him first. But she kissed him anyway, pressing her mouth to his with all the pent-up feelings she'd been trying to bury. For half a second, he froze. Then he was kissing her back, one hand coming up to cup her face, the other still firm around her waist. It was nothing like the chaste kisses she'd seen at society weddings. It was real and raw and tasted like the coffee they'd both drunk after dinner. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "So," he said roughly, "I'm guessing you're not opposed to complicating things? I've been complicated since the day we met. Might as well keep the pattern going." He laughed, actually laughed, deep and genuine. Yeah, that's true." They stood there in the dark pasture, holding each other while the lantern burned low and the stars wheeled overhead. And Joanna thought about how far she'd come from that girl standing in the hallway of her parents' house, listening to them celebrate her departure. That girl had been broken, certain she was worth nothing. This woman knew better. They were married 3 weeks later in the valley's small chapel, with Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands as witnesses. Joanna wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Gideon had brought back from town, pale gray with tiny blue flowers that matched the shawl Mary had given her. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would have passed muster at a Whitmore family event. It was perfect. The ceremony was short, officiated by a circuit preacher who came through once a month. Gideon's hands shook when he slid the ring onto her finger, a plain gold band he'd ordered from a jeweler 2 towns over. When the preacher told him he could kiss his bride, he did so carefully, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. Afterward, there was a celebration at the ranch house. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself with food, and someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing in the yard until well past midnight. Joanna danced with Gideon, who moved with surprising grace for such a big man, and with Marcus and Tom and even old Pete, who complained about his hip the whole time but kept going anyway. Sarah's children presented her with wildflowers they'd picked that morning. Billy gave an embarrassingly heartfelt speech about how she was the best thing that had happened to the valley since someone invented the water pump. Gideon stood beside her through it all, his hand resting on the small of her back, a constant, grounding presence. When the last guest finally stumbled off to their cabin, Joanna and Gideon climbed the stairs to his room. Their room now. She'd moved her things in that morning, her few possessions looking lost in the larger space. "You nervous?" Gideon asked, shrugging out of his jacket. "Should I be?" "I don't know. Are you?" Joanna thought about it honestly. "No. Nervous would mean I wasn't sure about this, and I'm sure." He crossed to her, cupping her face in his hands. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worth that certainty." "You already are." What followed was awkward and sweet, and nothing like the dramatic romance novels Elise used to read. They fumbled with buttons and laughed when Gideon got tangled in his shirt. Joanna discovered he had a scar on his shoulder from a cattle accident, and 3 more on his back she'd never seen. He was gentle with her, almost too gentle, until she told him she wouldn't break. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. "I never thought I'd have this," she said quietly. "Have what?" "Someone who chooses me. Not because they have to, not because I'm useful, but just because they want to." Gideon's arm tightened around her. "I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life. That's a promise." She believed him. The months that followed were the happiest Joanna had ever known. She and Gideon fell into an easy rhythm, working together during the day, sharing meals with Mrs. Chen and often the ranch hands, spending their evenings going over accounts or planning improvements to the ranch. At night they shared a bed, learning each other's bodies and habits and preferences. It wasn't always smooth. Gideon had a tendency to make decisions without consulting her, a habit from years of working alone. Joanna had to learn to accept help instead of trying to do everything herself. They argued sometimes, sharp, honest disagreements that would have scandalized her mother but cleared the air between them. "You can't just decide to sell off half the cattle without talking to me first," Joanna said one morning after discovering he'd made a deal with a buyer from the next valley. I've been making those decisions for 10 years without anyone's input. Well, you've got input now. That's what partners do. They discuss things. Gideon's jaw tightened. I'm not used to answering to anyone. I'm not asking you to answer to me. I'm asking you to include me. There's a difference. They stared at each other across the kitchen table. Then Gideon sighed and ran a hand through his hair. You're right. I should have talked to you first. I'm sorry. The apology surprised her. Her father had never apologized for anything in his life. Thank you, she said. And for what it's worth, I think selling some of the cattle before winter is smart. I just want to be part of the conversation. Deal. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with snow and wind that tested every weakness in the ranch's infrastructure. They lost 2 calves to the cold despite their best efforts, and a section of fence collapsed under heavy snow, requiring repairs in freezing temperatures. But they also discovered strengths in their partnership they hadn't known existed. Gideon's physical power and Joanna's strategic thinking complemented each other perfectly. When a blizzard trapped 3 workers in a far cabin without adequate supplies, Gideon led the rescue while Joanna coordinated from the house, mapping the safest route and timing their departure between storm surges. The children's lessons moved indoors to the ranch house's sitting room, where a stove kept everyone warm. Joanna taught reading and arithmetic while snow piled against the windows. She discovered that Jack's daughter had a gift for numbers and started giving her more advanced problems. Billy's nephew could barely sit still, but had an amazing memory. He could recite entire passages after hearing them once. You're changing things here, Mrs. Chen told her one evening while they prepared dinner. In good ways. I'm just teaching some children to read. You're doing more than that. You're giving them futures beyond ranch work, choices. That matters. By the time spring arrived, melting snow and revealing brown earth, the valley felt completely like home. Joanna couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The isolation she'd once feared had become a comfort. Here, she didn't have to perform or pretend. She could be herself, sharp-tongued and opinionated and fiercely protective of the people she'd come to care about. She was standing in the garden one April morning, planning where to expand the vegetable plots, when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Visitors were rare enough to be noteworthy. Gideon was out checking the north pasture, so Joanna walked to the front of the house to see who'd come. The wagon that rolled to a stop was far fancier than anything that usually came to the valley. Polished wood and brass fittings, pulled by matched horses that had clearly never done a day of hard work. The driver wore livery that looked absurd in the rugged landscape, and climbing down from the back, moving stiffly like the journey had been hard on him, was Charles Whitmore. Joanna's whole body went cold. Her father looked older than she remembered, his face more lined, his hair grayer. He wore an expensive suit that was dusty from travel, and his shoes were completely wrong for the muddy yard. Behind him, her mother emerged, then Vivian and Elise, her entire family. Here. Joanna, her father said, and his voice cracked on her name. Thank heavens we found you. She stood frozen, unable to process what she was seeing. They'd never visited, never written, except for one brief, cold letter of congratulations on her marriage. In 8 months, they'd given no indication they even remembered her existence. What are you doing here? The question came out flat. We need to talk to you. Charles glanced around the yard, taking in the barn, the workers' cabins, the functional simplicity of everything. His expression was hard to read. Is there somewhere private we can speak? No. Joanna, please, this is important. Then say it here. Her mother stepped forward, and Joanna noticed she was wearing black, mourning clothes. Who died? Joanna asked before she could stop herself. No one. Not yet. Her mother's voice wavered, though it's been difficult. So very difficult. What mother means, Vivian cut in, her tone sharp despite the circles under her eyes, is that we're ruined, completely and utterly ruined, and we need your help. The words hung in the air. Joanna felt like she was watching this scene from a distance, like it was happening to someone else. Ruined, she repeated. The business collapsed, Charles said heavily. My partners were engaged in certain activities, illegal activities. When it came to light, I was implicated. The authorities seized our assets. The house is gone. Our accounts, frozen. We have nothing left. You were involved, Joanna said. It wasn't a question. Her father's face flushed. I didn't know the full extent. You knew enough. I tried to tell you years ago that Councilman Porter's deals looked suspicious, that the profit margins didn't make sense. You told me to mind my own business. This isn't the time for I told you so, Elise snapped. Isn't it? Joanna felt something hot and sharp rising in her chest. You come here after 8 months of silence, tell me you're ruined, and expect what exactly? We need money, Vivian said bluntly, and somewhere to stay while we sort things out. You're married to a wealthy rancher. Surely you can… No. The word came out harder than Joanna intended, but she didn't soften it. Charles's face darkened. You haven't even heard what we're asking. I don't need to. The answer is no. We're your family, her mother said, tears starting down her face. You can't just abandon us in our hour of need. It's cruel. It's unnatural. Unnatural. Joanna laughed, and it sounded harsh even to her own ears. You want to talk about unnatural? How about a family that treats their youngest daughter like a servant, that mocks her, dismisses her, celebrates when they can finally be rid of her? We never… her mother started. I heard you. That night before I left. I stood in the hallway and listened to all of you toast to being rid of the burden. You called my marriage a perfect solution, said you almost felt sorry for the man who'd gotten himself stuck with me. Her father had the grace to look ashamed, but Vivian's face was defiant. You were difficult, Vivian said. You made everything harder with your opinions and your holier-than-thou attitude. We did what we had to do. And now I'm doing what I have to do, protecting the life I built, the people I care about. You're not taking that from me. Joanna, please. Her mother moved closer, hands outstretched in supplication. We made mistakes. We can admit that now, but we're desperate. Your sisters have no prospects. Your father faces criminal charges. If you don't help us, we'll end up on the streets. Part of Joanna wanted to feel something, pity, triumph, even satisfaction. But all she felt was tired. You should leave, she said quietly. This is absurd, Charles blustered. I'm your father. You owe me. I owe you nothing. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted whatever her father was about to say. Gideon rode into the yard, taking in the scene with a quick, assessing glance. He dismounted and crossed to stand beside Joanna. Problem? He asked, his voice neutral, but his posture protective. These are the Whitmores, Joanna said. They were just leaving. We most certainly are not, Vivian said. We've traveled for days to get here. The least you can do is offer us hospitality while we discuss this reasonably. Gideon looked at Joanna. You want them to stay? No. Then they're leaving. He turned to Charles. You heard my wife. Time to go. Now wait just a minute. Charles started forward, his face red with anger. You can't just… eat. Gideon stepped between him and Joanna. He didn't raise his voice or make any threatening gesture. He simply stood there, solid and immovable, and something in his presence made Charles stop talking. My wife said no, Gideon repeated, each word deliberate. That's the end of the discussion. You can leave on your own, or I can have my men help you leave. Your choice. This is outrageous, Vivian said. Joanna, are you really going to let him? He's not letting me do anything. I made my own decision. You're not welcome here. Her mother sobbed. Elise looked furious. Vivian's face was twisted with something between rage and disbelief. But it was her father's expression that stuck with Joanna the moment he realized he had no power over her anymore, that she was beyond his reach, his control, his ability to manipulate or intimidate. You'll regret this, Charles said, trying to salvage some authority. When we're gone and you're left with nothing but this wilderness and these rough people, you'll wish you'd helped us. No, Joanna said clearly, I really won't, because these rough people have shown me more kindness and respect in 8 months than you did in 23 years. I chose them, and I'd make that choice again every single day. Charles opened his mouth, closed it, then turned sharply and climbed back into the wagon. Her mother followed, still crying. Vivian shot Joanna one last venomous look before getting in. Elise paused at the wagon step. You've changed, she said, and for once there was no mockery in her voice, just observation. Yes, Joanna agreed, I have. They watched the wagon pull away, dust rising in its wake. Joanna stood rigid until it disappeared from view, then all the strength seemed to drain out of her at once. She swayed, and Gideon caught her, pulling her against his chest. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I don't know. Ask me later." He held her there in the yard while the sun climbed higher and the sounds of the ranch continued around them. Cattle lowing, Marcus calling to someone across the pasture, the clang of metal from the barn where Tom was repairing a plow. Normal sounds, safe sounds. "They'll probably spread rumors about you," Gideon said eventually. "Tell people you're cruel, unnatural, that you abandoned your family." "I know. Does that bother you?" Joanna thought about it. "No, because the people whose opinions I care about know the truth. Everyone else can think what they want." "That's my girl." She pulled back to look at him. "You knew they'd come eventually, didn't you? That's why you asked if I was sure about refusing them. You were testing me." "Not testing, trusting. There's a difference." Gideon brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I knew you'd make the right choice for yourself. I just wanted to make sure you knew it too." Mrs. Chen appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Everything all right out here?" "Fine," Joanna called back. "Just some people who took a wrong turn." The older woman's eyes narrowed like she knew there was more to the story, but she didn't push. "Lunch in an hour. Don't be late." That night, lying in bed with Gideon's arm around her, Joanna waited for the guilt to come. The doubt. The voice in her head saying she should have helped them, should have shown mercy, should have been the bigger person. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt lighter, like she'd been carrying something heavy for years and had finally set it down. "Tell me what you're thinking," Gideon said in the darkness. "I'm thinking about something you said once, about people who live by lies, fearing those who speak the truth." "Yeah?" "They were terrified of me. Not because I was cruel or unusual or difficult, but because I kept pointing out things they wanted to ignore. Their corruption, their cruelty, the way they used people, and they couldn't make me stop, so they tried to make me small instead. Invisible. Something they could control." "But you're not small." "No, I'm not. It just took me a long time to remember that." Gideon pressed a kiss to her temple. "You showed them today. Showed them exactly who you've become. Someone who doesn't need their approval or their money or their love. Someone who built a life on her own terms." "Our terms," Joanna corrected. "I didn't do this alone." "No, but you did the hard part. You chose to leave, chose to risk everything on a stranger's proposal. That took more courage than anything I've ever done." She turned in his arms to face him. "You gave me a place where that courage could grow. That matters just as much." They lay there in comfortable silence, and Joanna thought about how far she'd traveled, not just in miles, but in every way that mattered. She'd left behind a family that never saw her and found people who did. She'd left behind a life of quiet desperation and built one of purpose and meaning. Over the next few weeks, word filtered back through various channels that the Whitmores had indeed landed in serious trouble. Charles faced trial for fraud and embezzlement. The family's reputation was destroyed. Vivian and Elise had been forced to take work as governesses in families far below their former social standing, a humiliation they apparently bore poorly. Some people in town wrote to Joanna, suggesting she had a moral obligation to help. She burned those letters without responding. Others wrote with quiet support. Mary sent a long letter describing how the Whitmore household had collapsed, the servants all let go, the estate sold to pay debts. She'd found new work with a kind family and was doing well. She hoped Joanna was happy. Joanna wrote back immediately. She was more than happy. She was free. Spring turned to summer, and the valley bloomed with life. The children's reading skills improved enough that Joanna started teaching basic writing. Sarah announced she was pregnant with her second child. The irrigation system Joanna had designed worked so well that Gideon started implementing it across other pastures. One evening in late June, Joanna was in the garden pulling weeds when she felt Gideon's presence behind her. "Come with me," he said. "I want to show you something." They rode out to the highest point on the ranch, a ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Below them, the ranch spread out like a living map. The house, the barn, the workers' cabins with smoke rising from their chimneys, the cattle grazing in the pastures, the creek winding through it all like a silver thread. "When I first bought this land," Gideon said, "I had a vision of what it could become, a place where people could work hard and be treated fairly, where families could build lives without fear of being cheated or exploited, where honesty mattered more than status. "You've built that," Joanna said. "We've built it. You made it better than I ever could have done alone." He turned to her. "The children reading and writing, the fair supply contracts you negotiated, the way you've made sure everyone's paid properly and treated with respect. That's not something I could have done. That's you." Joanna felt warmth spread through her chest. "We make a good team." "Yeah, we do." He paused, looking out over the valley. "I've been thinking about expanding, buying the adjacent property when it comes up for sale next year, building more housing for workers and their families, maybe even starting a real school." "That's ambitious." "Too ambitious?" "No, just ambitious enough." Joanna leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We'll make it work. We always do." They stood there as the sun sank lower, watching their valley settle into evening. Somewhere below, someone was playing a fiddle. Children's laughter carried on the wind. A dog barked. The sounds of home. "Do you ever miss it?" Gideon asked. "Your old life, the fancy house, the society, the No," Joanna interrupted. "Not even a little bit. That was never my life. It was a prison I was born into. This," she gestured at the valley, "this is my life. The one I chose, the one I built, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." Gideon kissed the top of her head. "Good, because I'm not letting you go. Good, because I'm not leaving." As darkness fell and stars began to appear, they rode back down to the ranch house. Mrs. Chen had dinner waiting, and the workers stopped by after eating to discuss plans for the next day. Marcus needed help moving cattle to a new pasture. Tom wanted Joanna's opinion on a drainage problem near his cabin. Old Pete complained about his hip but refused to slow down. Normal evening, normal problems, normal life. It was everything Joanna had never known she needed. Later, much later, lying in bed with Gideon's breathing deep and even beside her, Joanna thought about her family, about the life they'd be living now, disgraced, struggling, probably blaming her for their troubles. She waited for guilt or pity or regret to surface. Instead, she felt nothing but a quiet, settled peace. She'd made her choice, chosen herself, chosen the people who valued her, chosen a life built on truth rather than pretty lies. And she'd never been more certain of anything. The first snow came in October, earlier than expected and heavier than anyone had predicted. Joanna woke to find the world transformed, white and silent, the valley buried under 2 feet of powder that was still falling. Beside her, Gideon was already awake, staring at the ceiling with the expression he got when he was calculating problems. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough. We need to get the cattle to lower pastures before they get trapped up high. And we need to check on the workers' cabins, make sure everyone has enough firewood and supplies." They dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, layering wool and oilcloth against the cold. Downstairs, Mrs. Chen already had coffee brewing and was packing food into saddlebags. "Tom and Marcus are already out," she said without preamble. "Spotted the storm coming last night and got a head start on moving the herd. But we're still short on hands if this keeps up." The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of brutal work in freezing temperatures, moving cattle through snow that reached the horses' bellies, clearing paths to cabins, hauling supplies to families who'd been caught unprepared. Joanna worked alongside the men, her face raw from wind, her fingers numb inside her gloves. She learned to read weather signs, to spot cattle in distress, to keep moving even when exhaustion made her want to collapse. On the second night, they lost old Pete. He'd been clearing snow from his cabin roof when his bad hip gave out. By the time they found him, he'd been lying in a drift for hours. They got him inside, got him warm, but the damage was done. He died the next morning with half the valley gathered around his bed, telling him stories about all the ridiculous things he'd done over the years. "Remember when you tried to rope that ornery bull and ended up in the water trough?" Marcus said, his voice rough. Pete's laugh was weak but genuine. "Damn bull had more sense than me." "You taught me everything I know about ranching," young Billy said, tears streaming down his face. "Everything that matters, anyway." "Then I didn't waste my time." Pete's eyes found Joanna. "You take care of this place, girl. You and that stubborn husband of yours. It's something worth keeping." "I will." she promised. He died an hour later, just as the storm finally broke and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds. They buried him on the ridge where Gideon had taken Joanna that summer evening, the whole valley in attendance. It was too cold for a long service, but everyone said something, told a story, shared a memory. The preacher spoke briefly about a life well lived and work honestly done. Joanna stood beside Gideon, watching them lower Pete into frozen ground, and understood something she'd never quite grasped before. Family wasn't just blood. It was the people who showed up when things got hard, who worked beside you and mourned beside you and built something together that mattered. These people were her family now, more than the Whitmores had ever been. Winter settled in hard after that. The valley became isolated, cut off from town by impassable roads and snow that kept falling in waves. They lived on stored supplies and rationed carefully. The children's lessons continued in the ranch house sitting room, which had become the warmest gathering place. Joanna taught reading and writing and arithmetic while outside the wind howled and the temperature dropped below zero. One evening in late November, Sarah went into labor 2 months early. Her husband Daniel pounded on the ranch house door at midnight, his face white with panic. "Something's wrong. The baby's coming too soon and Sarah's bleeding and I don't know what to do." Joanna was moving before he finished talking. She grabbed supplies, woke Mrs. Chen, sent Billy running to fetch the 2 other women in the valley who'd birthed children before. Then she went to Sarah's cabin and found organized chaos. Sarah in bed, pale and frightened, her water broken and contractions coming fast. "I'm scared," Sarah gasped between pains. "It's too early. The baby won't make it. I won't—" Stop that. Joanna's voice came out sharper than she intended, but it cut through Sarah's rising panic. "You're going to be fine. The baby's going to be fine. But I need you to focus and do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, eyes wide. The next 6 hours were the longest of Joanna's life. She'd never delivered a baby before, had only the vaguest idea of what she was doing. But she had Mrs. Chen, who'd helped birth half the valley's children, and she had the other women who talked Sarah through each contraction, each push, each moment of terror and pain. The baby came just before dawn, a tiny, red-faced boy who wasn't breathing. Joanna's heart stopped. Then Mrs. Chen was there, taking the infant, clearing his mouth, rubbing his chest with practiced hands. For 5 endless seconds, nothing happened. Then the baby gasped, coughed, started crying with the fury of someone deeply offended by the whole process of being born. Sarah sobbed. Daniel collapsed against the wall. Joanna felt her legs go weak with relief. "He's small," Mrs. Chen said, wrapping the baby in blankets. "Real small. Next few days are critical. But he's breathing on his own, and that's what matters." They named him Peter, after old Pete. And against all odds, despite his early arrival and tiny size, he survived. Thrived, even. Within a week, he was nursing well. Within 2, he'd gained enough weight that Mrs. Chen stopped looking worried every time she checked on him. "You saved them," Daniel told Joanna one morning when she stopped by to bring fresh milk. Sarah and the baby both. "If you hadn't been there, known what to do, Mrs. Chen knew what to do. I just helped. You kept Sarah calm, kept all of us from panicking. That mattered just as much as the medicine." Joanna looked at the baby sleeping in his mother's arms, this tiny life that had almost slipped away. "I'm just glad he's all right." "We're naming you godmother," Sarah insisted. "Hope that's okay." It was more than okay. It was another thread connecting her to this place, these people. Another way of being family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. December brought a brief thaw, then more snow. The supplies were holding, but barely. Gideon made the decision to slaughter 2 steers to feed everyone through the rest of winter. It was a calculated loss, but necessary. "We'll rebuild the herd in spring," he told Joanna, as they worked side by side in the barn, butchering meat to be smoked and stored. "Right now, keeping everyone fed is priority." "The Hendersons are down to almost nothing," Joanna said. She'd been keeping careful track of each family's supplies. And Marcus mentioned his sister's family is struggling too. "We'll send them shares. Everyone eats, or no one does." It was this kind of decision, the automatic assumption that they'd share what they had, that made Joanna love him more every day. He could have hoarded resources, kept his own family safe while letting others struggle. Instead, he treated the valley like a community that rose or fell together. She told him so that night, lying in bed with the wind rattling the windows. "It's not generosity," he said, running his fingers through her hair. "It's practicality. If the Hendersons starve, we lose good workers. If Marcus's sister's family goes under, that's knowledge and skills gone from the valley. We need everyone to make this work." Most people wouldn't see it that way. Most people would say, "Take care of your own first, let others fend for themselves." Your family thought that way. Look where it got them. He had a point. By January, cabin fever was setting in. Everyone was tired of being cooped up, tired of the cold, tired of rationed food and limited space. Small arguments erupted over nothing. Billy and one of Jack's sons got into a fistfight over a perceived slight. Two of the women stopped speaking to each other over some imagined insult. Joanna called a gathering at the ranch house on a Sunday afternoon. Everyone crammed into the sitting room and kitchen, filling every available space. "I know we're all going crazy," she said without preamble. "I know the winter feels endless and we're sick of each other and everything's too hard. But we need to remember why we're here. We're building something, and that means sticking together even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." "Easy for you to say," someone muttered. "You've got the big house and plenty of supplies." Joanna didn't flinch. "You're right. Gideon and I have more space and better resources. So here's what we're going to do. Every family sends someone to the ranch house 3 nights a week for dinner. We'll rotate so everyone gets a break from cooking. The children can play together and burn off energy. The adults can talk to someone other than the same 4 people they've been stuck with for 2 months. That's a lot of extra mouths to feed," Tom pointed out. "We'll make it work. Everyone brings what they can contribute, even if it's just company." The dinners became a lifeline. 3 nights a week, the ranch house filled with noise and chaos and the kind of community that made isolation bearable. Children ran through the rooms while adults talked and laughed and complained about the weather. Mrs. Chen taught Sarah and the other women her recipes. Gideon and the men played cards and argued about livestock management, and slowly the tension eased. People remembered they actually liked each other, that they were in this together. One night in late January, after everyone had gone home and Joanna was cleaning up the kitchen, Gideon came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You're amazing, you know that?" "I served dinner." "It's not exactly heroic. You held this valley together when it was about to fracture. You gave people a reason to keep being decent to each other. That's more than heroic. That's leadership." Joanna leaned back against him, letting herself feel the solid warmth of his presence. "I just did what needed doing." "Exactly. That's who you are. Someone who sees what needs doing and does it without waiting for permission or recognition." She thought about the girl she'd been a year ago, terrified to speak up, constantly second-guessing herself, believing she was worthless because her family had told her so. That girl felt like a stranger now. "I've changed," she said quietly. "No. You've just become who you always were underneath. The valley didn't change you. It gave you room to grow." February brought the worst storm yet. 5 days of howling wind and snow that came down so thick you couldn't see 3 feet in front of your face. They lost a section of barn roof despite their best efforts to reinforce it. 3 calves froze to death. One of the workers' cabins had its chimney collapse, forcing that family to move into the ranch house until repairs could be made. But they survived. And when March finally arrived with its promise of thaw and spring, the valley emerged battered but intact. Every family had made it through. Every child was healthy. The cattle herd was smaller than they'd like, but large enough to rebuild from. "We did it," Marcus said one morning as they surveyed the damage and made repair lists. "Honestly didn't think we would at some points, but we did. We'll do it again next winter," Gideon said, "and the winter after that, until we've built systems strong enough that we don't have to just survive. We can actually thrive." "Big dreams," Tom said, but he was smiling. Someone's got to have them. As the snow melted and exposed brown earth, Joanna found herself thinking about her family again. Not with longing or regret, but with a kind of detached curiosity. She wondered how they'd survived the winter, whether Charles had gone to prison, whether her sisters had adjusted to their reduced circumstances. A letter arrived in early April, forwarded through several addresses before finally reaching the valley. It was from Mary. "Dear Joanna, I hope this letter finds you well and happy. I think of you often and wonder how you're managing in that far valley. I'm writing with news I thought you should know. Your father was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud. Your mother has moved in with distant relatives who don't want her but couldn't refuse. Vivian married a clerk from the courthouse, not for love, I gather, but for security. Elise is working as a governess for a family with 6 wild children and by all accounts is miserable. I tell you this not because I think you should feel guilty or rush to help them. I tell you because you have a right to know, and because I want you to understand something important. They brought this on themselves. Every choice they made, every cruelty they inflicted, every moment they chose selfishness over decency, it all led them here. You, on the other hand, chose differently, and I suspect you're reaping the rewards of those better choices. Please write when you can. I'd love to hear about your life. With affection, Mary Joanna read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in the drawer with other important papers. She waited for some emotional response. Satisfaction, pity, vindication, guilt. Instead, she felt simply distant. Like Mary was reporting news about strangers she'd once known briefly. That night, she told Gideon about the letter. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "I don't know. Thought I'd feel something stronger, but mostly I just feel nothing. Is that wrong?" "No, it's healthy." He pulled her closer. "You've moved on, built a life that doesn't include them. It makes sense they'd fade into background noise. I think I worried I'd always carry them with me. Their voices in my head telling me I wasn't good enough, their judgment weighing on everything I did." "And do you?" Joanna considered it honestly. "No, not anymore. Somewhere along the way I stopped hearing them, started hearing myself instead." "Good. That's how it should be." Spring brought new life to the valley. Baby Peter was thriving, growing fat and happy under his mother's care. The cattle that had survived winter began calving, slowly rebuilding the herd. Gardens were planted, repairs were made. The children's reading lessons moved outside when the weather allowed. Everyone sitting in the grass while Joanna taught from books Gideon had ordered from back east. In May, Jack's daughter, the one with the gift for numbers, asked if she could learn bookkeeping. "I want to help run a ranch someday," she said, her face serious. "Or maybe a store, but I need to understand accounts and ledgers and all that." Joanna started teaching her alongside the regular lessons. Within weeks, the girl was helping with the ranch books, catching small errors and suggesting more efficient ways to track expenses. "She's good," Gideon said one evening, watching the girl work through a particularly complex calculation. "Really good. We should send her to a proper school when she's older." "That costs money." "Then we'll save money. Talent like that shouldn't be wasted." It became a pattern. Whenever one of the children showed particular promise or interest in something, they found ways to nurture it. Billy's nephew, with the amazing memory, started learning poetry and history, able to recite entire passages from books Joanna read aloud. Another child showed artistic talent and was given paper and charcoal to practice with. "You're changing futures," Mrs. Chen observed one afternoon. "These kids, they'll have choices their parents never did, because you taught them to read and write and think. We're just teaching them basics." "No, you're teaching them they matter, that their minds are valuable. That's a lot more than basics." By summer, the valley had not just recovered from winter, but was actively thriving. The irrigation systems Joanna had designed were working perfectly. The cattle herd was growing, the workers' families were healthy and fed, and their children were learning skills that would serve them for life. One evening in late June, Joanna and Gideon rode back up to the ridge where they'd scattered old Pete's ashes. The valley spread below them, golden in the setting sun, exactly as it had looked the first time he'd brought her here. But so much had changed. "You know what I realized today?" Joanna said, watching smoke rise from the workers' cabins. "My family thought they were punishing me by sending me away. They thought Gideon Hale would be stuck with a difficult, opinionated woman who'd make his life miserable. And instead, he got the best thing that ever happened to him," Gideon finished. "I was going to say we built something neither of us could have built alone, but your version works too." He laughed and pulled her close. "I love you. You know that, right? I don't say it enough, but I do. You're everything I didn't know I needed. I love you too, even when you make decisions without consulting me. I'm getting better about that." "You are, slowly." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower. Below them, someone lit a lamp in their cabin window. Then another. Soon the valley was dotted with small points of light, each one a family, a life, a story that was part of the larger tapestry they were weaving together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen you that day in the market square?" Gideon asked. "Sometimes, but not in a sad way. More like grateful way. Grateful that you did see me, that you saw past the plain dress and rough hands to who I actually was. Someone worth knowing. Someone worth choosing." The words hung between them, simple but weighted with meaning, because that's what they'd both done, chosen each other, chosen this life, chosen to build something based on truth and work and mutual respect rather than pretty lies and social expectations. As summer deepened, word spread through the region about the valley and what was being built there. Other ranchers started asking Gideon about his irrigation systems. Families inquired about work, drawn by reports of fair wages and decent treatment. A young couple showed up in August, newly married and looking for a place to start their life. "We heard you run things different here," the man said, hat in hand. "Fair and honest. That true?" "We try to be," Gideon said, "but it's not easy, and we don't always get it right. Right enough is better than what we've got elsewhere." They hired the couple to work one of the far pastures. Within a month, they'd proven themselves capable and were talking about building their own cabin, putting down roots. The valley was growing, becoming something bigger than just Gideon's ranch. It was becoming a community built on principles that seemed radical to outsiders, but made perfect sense to the people living them. Honesty over deception, fairness over exploitation, hard work over inherited privilege. In September, a traveling journalist came through, writing a piece about frontier life. He spent 3 days in the valley, talking to workers and families, watching how things operated. "This is unusual," he told Joanna over dinner at the ranch house. "Most operations this size, there's clear hierarchy. Owner at the top, workers at the bottom. Everyone knows their place. But here," he gestured around the table where ranch hands sat alongside Gideon and Joanna, everyone talking and laughing together. "It's different. People work better when they're treated like people," Joanna said. "Seems simple enough." Simple in theory, rare in practice. His article, when it was published in a Denver newspaper, called the Valley an experiment in cooperative ranching and a model for how frontier communities might organize themselves around principles of mutual benefit rather than pure profit. The article brought more visitors, some genuinely interested, others skeptical and looking to prove the whole thing was doomed to fail. "They want us to fail," Marcus observed one evening, "because if we succeed, it means they've been doing things wrong. And nobody likes being told they're wrong." "Then we won't fail," Gideon said simply. "We'll keep doing what works and let the results speak for themselves." By October, as the first snow began to fall and the valley prepared for another winter, Joanna took stock of everything they'd built. The ranch was profitable and growing. The workers were healthy and their families thriving. The children could all read and write, and several were advancing to more complex subjects. They'd established supply chains that were reliable even in bad weather. They'd built systems that distributed resources fairly and ensured no one went without basics. More than that, they'd built community, real community, where people looked out for each other not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. "We did something here," she told Gideon one night as they prepared for bed. "Something that matters." "You did something. I just provided the land." "No, we did it together. Your fairness and my organization, your strength and my planning. Neither of us could have done this alone." He pulled her into his arms and she rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and sure, like everything else about him. "I think about that girl my family tried to throw away," she said quietly. "The one they thought was worthless. And I wish I could go back and tell her that they were wrong, that she was valuable and capable and strong, that she just needed the chance to prove it." "You don't need to go back. You proved it every day since you got here." "I know, but I wish she'd known. Wish she hadn't spent so many years believing their lies." "Maybe that's the point," Gideon said thoughtfully. "Maybe she had to believe them for a while so she'd recognize truth when she finally found it. Maybe all that struggle made you, into someone who couldn't be broken by anything else." Joanna considered that. "You think my family's cruelty made me stronger?" "I think you made yourself stronger despite their cruelty. There's a difference. They tried to break you, and you refused to break. That's all you, not them. It was a perspective she'd never considered before. She'd always thought of those years as wasted time, suffering that served no purpose. But maybe Gideon was right. Maybe enduring that period had forged something in her that couldn't be forged any other way. A determination to live by truth, a refusal to accept mistreatment, a bone-deep understanding of what mattered and what didn't. Besides, Gideon continued, if they hadn't treated you badly enough to send you away, we never would have met. So in a twisted way, their worst qualities led to my best luck. Joanna laughed. That's one way to look at it. It's the only way I want to look at it, because every other version means I don't get you, and that's unacceptable. The second winter was easier than the first. They'd learned from their mistakes, stored more supplies, reinforced weak structures, established better communication between cabins. When storms came, they were ready. When problems arose, they had systems in place to handle them. And when Old Man Henderson from the neighboring ranch showed up in January asking for help, his cattle were starving and he didn't know how to save them. They didn't hesitate. Gideon sent Marcus and Tom to help move Henderson's herd to better grazing. Joanna organized food supplies to keep Henderson's family fed. It cost them resources they could barely spare, but it was the right thing to do. You didn't have to do that, Henderson said, his voice gruff with emotion, after I was so skeptical about your way of doing things. Being skeptical isn't a crime, Gideon said, and neighbors help neighbors. That's how this works. Word of that kindness spread. By spring, 3 other small ranchers had approached Gideon about adopting some of his methods: the irrigation systems, the fair wage structures, the cooperative approach to problem solving. The valley's influence was growing beyond its own boundaries. In March, Joanna received another letter from Mary. This one came with news that Charles had died in prison, pneumonia, poorly treated. Her mother had passed shortly after from what Mary delicately called a broken heart, but what probably meant she'd given up once Charles was gone. Vivian and Elise were both married now, both struggling in their reduced circumstances, both bitter about the lives they'd lost. Joanna read the letter and felt nothing. No grief, no vindication. Just a distant acknowledgement that those chapters of her life were closed. She told Gideon about it that night. "Does it bother you that you don't feel more?" he asked. "Should it?" "I'm asking what you think, not what you should think." Joanna considered. "No, it doesn't bother me. They made their choices, lived their lives. I'm living mine, and the person I've become barely remembers the girl they tried to destroy." "Good, because that girl doesn't exist anymore. She grew into someone stronger, someone better, someone who knows her own worth." It was true. The frightened, uncertain girl who'd left Millbrook was gone. In her place stood a woman who ran a valley, taught children, made decisions that affected dozens of lives, and did it all with confidence born from hard-won experience. She'd become someone her younger self wouldn't have recognized, and that was exactly as it should be. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, the pattern of their lives continued. Work and rest, challenges and victories, small failures and larger successes. They added more workers to the ranch, started plans for a real schoolhouse to be built next spring, helped Sarah's family build a bigger cabin now that Peter was walking and another baby was on the way. The children Joanna had taught to read were now reading to younger children. The workers she and Gideon treated fairly were treating others the same way. The principles they'd established were spreading, taking root, growing into something that would outlast them both. One evening in late September, Joanna stood on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, a view she'd seen hundreds of times but never tired of. Gideon came out to join her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, handing her a cup. "How far we've come. How much has changed. Any regrets?" "Not a single one." And she meant it. Every choice that had led her here, the painful ones, the scary ones, the ones that felt impossible at the time, they'd all been worth it, because they'd led her to this moment, this place, this life. She thought about her family sometimes, but less and less as time passed. They'd become background noise in her story, important for understanding where she'd come from, but irrelevant to where she was going. The people who mattered were here, in this valley, building something that would last because it was built on truth and fairness and the simple revolutionary idea that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. "I love you," she told Gideon, leaning into his warmth. "I love you too, always have. From the moment I saw you stand up for that old man in the market square. That was just doing the right thing." "Exactly, exactly. And you've never stopped doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it costs you. That's who you are." Joanna smiled. "Then I guess your family was right to be worried when they sent me away. I did exactly what they feared, became someone who wouldn't stay quiet or small or contained, someone who spoke truth and demanded fairness and refused to accept less than she deserved." "Their loss," Gideon said. "My gain." "Our gain," she corrected. "Because we built this together." They stood there as darkness fell and stars emerged, watching their valley settle into evening. Below, lights flickered on in cabin windows. Somewhere a child laughed. Cattle lowed in the distance. The creek murmured its endless song. All the sounds of home, of family, of a life built on purpose rather than inherited from circumstance. Joanna had been thrown away by people who couldn't see her value. And in being thrown away, she'd found her way to a place where value was measured differently. Not by beauty or breeding or social standing, but by character and work and the courage to stand up for what mattered. She'd been called worthless and had proven them catastrophically wrong. She'd been sent away as punishment and had turned it into freedom. She'd been meant to fail and had built an empire instead. Not an empire of money or land or power over others, but something more valuable. A community where people could be honest and work hard and know they'd be treated fairly. Where children could learn and grow beyond their parents' limitations. Where the measure of a person was what they did, not who they were born as. That was her legacy. Not the wealth she'd rejected or the family name she'd left behind, but the lives she'd touched and the future she'd helped build. And standing there on the porch of the home she'd chosen, beside the man who'd seen her worth when no one else did, Joanna understood something profound. The people who'd rejected her had done her the greatest favor of her life, because in trying to get rid of her, they'd set her free. And freedom, she'd learned, was worth more than all the approval in the world.